Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the fascinating and brutal story of the machine gun on the Western Front. We'll look at its early development, evolution on the battlefield, and consider whether it was the defining weapon of trench warfare. Oh, hi again, Dan. Always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And this week we're talking about a weapon that it existed before the First World War, but in many ways it would come of age in the First World War and is now still a definitive part of warfare more than a century later. And that's the machine gun. And this, I think, is going to be a really fascinating dive into both the technical capabilities of machine guns and the tactics of machine guns.
Yeah, hi Spence. It's as you say, machine guns. If you were to play the old, I suppose if you like the trench warfare quiz, and you were to ask people to name a handful of different words associated with it, I think we're going to find mud in there fairly quick. Probably trenches, various other bits. Machine guns certainly getting thrown into that equation, and I think for good reason as well. As you rightly say, we'll maybe come on to whether it comes to define trench warfare. I think it's an interesting question, but certainly it has an enormous impact and influence on it. Perhaps in some ways bigger than actually what it represents in terms of casualty numbers. And I think that's particularly intriguing. But in order to set the scene as per usual, I think we want to go back in time a little bit and just discuss kind of the origins of the machine gun. And I know this is a part of world history that you really enjoy, and it takes us typically, but not exclusively, to North America.
One of the curious things about machine guns is people have been trying to invent machine guns for centuries. Some listeners, if you're interested in medieval and Renaissance warfare, you might be familiar with the concept of the organ gun, which is strange multi-barreled weapon that can fire all of its guns at once. And there's been various attempts to try and create better loading systems, have a possibility of multiple guns firing at the pull of a single trigger or the pull of a single cord, and really none of it's worked. There's all kinds of problems. There's problems of reloading is the main problem. And the breakthrough weapon is actually an American invention, which I'm sure listeners, you'll know the name, even if you couldn't swear to exactly how it works, what it looks like. And this is the Gatling gun, which is invented around about 1861, put into production in 1862. And this is a crank-handled machine gun. And in fact, that cranking of the handle is what rotates the barrels so they can constantly move. More bullets can be fed into it through a belt system, and you can produce an enormous amount of firepower without reloading. And the Gatling gun, as well as just being able to produce lots and lots of bullets at once, it's also a pretty stable platform because it's mounted on a tripod. It'll mount on a frame, which means that the gun itself stays relatively static. Not completely static. Early machine guns do tend to kick a little, so they can tend to fire high. But it's a bit of a breakthrough in how machine guns function. Compared to the machine guns of the First World War, it's pretty crude. It's not mechanically supremely reliable. It has certain problems, and it doesn't really see any action in the American Civil War. There are some Gatling guns floating around the Union in the American Civil War in defensive positions, and I stand to be corrected, listeners, I don't think a Gatling gun fires any bullets in anger in the American Civil War. But if I've got that wrong, let me know in the comments. But this principle, the fact that Gatling gun exists, is a breakthrough in really machine gun technology, because once it's been found you can do this, inevitably other armies start to look for this. And the initial machine guns are powered by a crank handle, which gives them the nickname coffee grinders. Sounds apparently not unlike a coffee grinder at work, and the motion's not entirely dissimilar. Like all cutting-edge technology, exactly how to use them is not entirely clear. There's certain problems with them, certain problems with reliability in particular. They tend to break down and jam very easily. These are still very cutting-edge fire weapons. But the real breakthrough, Dan, is actually the Maxim gun in 1884, which is going to be quite literally the father of all the machine guns that we see in the British and the German armies, heavy machine guns in the British and German armies in the First World War. And the story of the Maxim gun and its invention, I think it's worth going into a little bit here, and I know you know something about this.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually. In fact, Hero Maxim, the kind of main character of this, I was just at his grave recently in West Norwood in London. Just to go back really quickly though, before you do that, as you were talking about the Gatling gun, I was just thinking of a particular scenario, which maybe in a way kind of illustrates some of the strength and some of the problems of things like the Gatling gun. It takes me back to 1876 and a famous bloke called George Custer, who goes chasing Indians. He's actually offered a pair of Gatling guns before going on his expedition to try and track down a band of Indians that escaped reservations and so on and so forth. He declines that because he says they're too slow. They're much slower than his cavalry force can move. But what's interesting is they actually the officers within that particular command prescribe a specific amount of firepower to that. They equate one Gatling gun to a company's worth of fire. So by carrying a Gatling gun with you, you've got one additional company's worth of firepower, which is really significant, actually. So if you can imagine, if we were to literally put a number on it, it's about 100 blokes worth of shooting, which is a lot. Problem is not particularly maneuverable, and that's going to be a problem that's going to stay with the machine gun as we really go through its life, and it's only going to get solved in the First World War. But yeah, going back, Spence, 1880s, got this bloke called Hiram Maxim, who actually is an American as well, born in Maine, and eventually comes to the UK and is going to be a naturalized British citizen by the time of his death. He is something of an inventor, actually. He really tries his hand on loads of different stuff. So he does some electronical stuff, big on powered flight, or trying to kind of address the issues around powered flight. Never really gets there, but is an interesting character. There's a famous quote, which I particularly like, which is when he meets a fellow American at a kind of conference for like-minded inventors in 1882 in Vienna, and discussing how best they can sort of make a bit of money and continue with their process of inventing stuff. Apparently, the phrase is uttered: "Hang your chemistry and electricity. If you want to make a pile of money, invent something that will enable these Europeans to cut each other's throat with greater facility." And I think that's pretty ruthless, but also it's actually not a million miles away from the story, because the rather unfortunate story about this is it's not quite the same, but it is effectively both the Vickers and the MG08 German heavy machine gun are effectively the same gun, both of which are really formulated by Hiram Maxim, who originally comes out with the idea. He's the first guy to really grasp the principle of blowback and gas power, and reusing the power that's the forces that are created by firing a weapon, to actually use that to recycle the motion in order to create a literal, if you like, a perpetual motion thing. So the gases coming out of the expended round are going to force the working parts back and allow it, literally a machine gun to develop in that sense. So he nails that down, patents it, gets the idea, eventually deafens himself in so many tests to try and figure out the best way to make this work. But ultimately, what he's going to come up with is the same machine gun that we're going to see really ruling the battlefield from both sides in the First World War. He's a fascinating character. He actually dies, Spence, in 1916. And I always wonder, I don't know, maybe there are quotes out there about this. I wonder if he reflected on the devastation that his inventions were doing on the battlefield, just what he might have said just at the time of his death.
An interesting point. Well, if he was following on that great quote you just given about Europeans cutting each other's throats with greater facility, he achieved his objective. But I wonder, indeed, whether he ever had any cause for reflection on the damage, in a way, his invention would go on to do. And just mention the European aspect, it's worth mentioning, too, that the machine gun is pivotal in colonial conquest, really from the 1880s onwards. The various things allow European powers to participate in the scramble for Africa, where you have really small forces of European soldiers overcome much, much larger armies of natives. Obviously, an equipment advantage, a firepower advantage, and a key element of this is, especially in country where it works, Sudan's a great example, is the existence of machine guns, which can just mow down so many of your opponents. They're rushing at you with spears, swords, this sort of things, handful of antiquated firearms. No match for a machine gun or a Gatling gun. And reminded of the now long forgotten in many ways poem, although you might know this line, ladies and gentlemen, Vitae Lampada, which is "They pass on the torch of life," which is a poem really about courage in Victorian society. and it's comparing the courage of playing in a cricket game back in England to what happens in the Sudan with a great couple of lines. The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of a square that broke. The Gatlings jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. He's actually referring to a real battle in the 1880s in Sudan, where once the Gatling broke down, disaster followed. So machine guns, if you want to look, listeners, for a sort of combat testing period, it's actually in colonial warfare where they are in some ways ideally suited. You can substitute the firepower of an entire battalion in a single machine gun. And although there's various problems with using machine guns out in the wars of empire, difficulty moving them, problems of getting sandy or damp or these sort of things, most European armies will not follow George Custer. They'll actually take these guns into action, even though they're slow and they're potentially heavy. Interesting point, though, the one major colonial war that Britain fights where machine guns don't do so well is the Boer War between 1899 and 1902. And British go to war with machine guns here, but they don't do very well. They don't have targets. The Boers are very, very good at taking cover. They tend to deploy themselves in the open, where they're obvious targets for Boer sharpshooters and snipers, get taken out really easily. And they're pretty slow and heavy to carry around as well. So in rapid operations, especially in the guerrilla war, they don't do very well. And in fact, Dan, you mentioned that both the Vickers machine gun of the British Army and the MG08 of the German Army have really the same father figure, the Maxim gun. One thing that is striking in the years leading up to the First World War is the difference in numbers. Although in terms of technical capacity, they're very, very similar. They're comparable. In terms of numbers, the British Army is quite far behind the Germans.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. In fact, it's quite famously illustrated. There's a couple of things that we can bring out here, and it takes us right to August of 1914. I think one of them is just how effective a single well-manned machine gun can be, but also how the British, when they go to war, perhaps with a slightly more old-fashioned perspective compared to the Germans, are really lacking in these things that can level a fight quite significantly, particularly if you're able to, for example, bottleneck your enemy into a certain location. Over a big wide area, yeah, machine guns may be slightly less effective. But if, for example, your enemy's got to cross a bridge and you've got a machine gun, you can do some real devastation. In fact, we're going to see this with the very famous action at the very earliest stage, at least from the British perspective of the Great War, where a single machine gun under the command of a Lieutenant Dease is going to really wreak havoc on a German attempts to cross the Mons Condé Canal at a place called Nimy at the Battle of Mons. So it's going to actually be the birth of the first two Victoria Crosses of the Great War, the first of which Dease is killed in manning one of his 2-battalion machine guns. Point being, there are only 2 per battalion at the start of the war, compared, correct me if I'm wrong, Spence, to 6, I think, German machine guns per battalion. So big difference, 3 times the firepower, or fire support, we should say. And then later on, a Private Godley is going to go on and fire off every round left in that machine gun before throwing probably the working parts into the canal and seemingly dying at the gun, but actually surviving. What's really interesting also displays just how rugged that gun is, because it's taken multiple hits. And it maybe gives us a chance, Spence, to talk a little bit about the specific design of the gun, because these guns are really rugged, and they've crucially got a feature which means you can fire them on a pretty long, lengthy basis as opposed to an air-cooled gun.
They do, and I'm glad you brought this point up, because the key feature of the Vickers and the MG08 is that they're water-cooled. And very early machine guns, the Gatling, for example, doesn't have that kind of cooling system. The advantage of water cooling is it's very, very easily renewed and replaced, compared to air cooling, where once your barrel has reached a certain temperature, unless you're fighting in the Antarctic, you just can't cool the barrel down. You just have to wait with it. The advantage of a water-cooled gun is you can always add more cool water to it. If necessary, you can change the entire barrel, or you can change the jacket that goes around the barrel to cool it, and within a few minutes, you're back down to a position you can fire, whereas air-cooled guns don't have that advantage. Air-cooled have some advantages. They tend to be lighter. They have certain advantages in terms of the number of parts that are required and so forth, so that they're not completely useless. And in fact, the French will use an air-cooled medium machine gun for the entire war, the Hotchkiss, and the American Army will adopt that too. But if you're looking to lay down the maximum amount of firepower for potentially hours, then the Vickers and the MG08 have that capacity, as long as you can keep changing the barrel and keeping the barrel cool. And you can do that with water. And this is what's going to make these two guns, and they are very, very similar, listeners, definitive weapons, especially in a defensive position. You mentioned, Dan, the action of the Royal Fusiliers machine gun section at Nimy Bridge. What's really interesting to zoom in on the action at Nimy Bridge too is it really illustrates all the things we're going to see for the remainder of the war regarding machine guns. The position that Dease and Godley's gun takes up is in some ways an exposed position. It's up on a railway embankment, so it can fire straight down the railway bridge. It can also pan across and shoot at German forces on the bank either side of the bridge. At the time, the British Army don't carry sandbags as a standard piece of equipment, so instead, with the aid of Belgian civilians, they use coal sacks that are just filled with dirt and are built in a relatively small emplacement around the gun to provide some protection. But this is not especially sophisticated or complex, and crucially, the gun is basically in the open, despite having this sandbag embrasure. And yet, despite this relatively crude setup, exposed position, only a few sandbags to protect it, the gun survives the entire action. Now, it comes at the cost of all of the crew. Dease, obviously wounded multiple times, dies of his wounds. Godley, severely wounded, passes out from blood loss and so forth, and is eventually captured. But the crucial thing is, once you're there and you have your Maxim gun, your Vickers gun set up on your tripod, you are in an incredibly strong position. You don't have to exert much muscle power to move that gun around. It's going to move on its tripod. It's going to be a very stable firing platform. As long as you've got ammunition, you can keep blasting rounds out. And these machine guns, accurate to a 2,000 yards over iron sights, can potentially reach 4,000 yards if you're firing at maximum elevation. Dease and Godley firing over iron sights at this battle. And the fact that despite the casualties, effectively this gun stays in action until it's completely run out of ammunition, despite being in an exposed position under very heavy German fire for hours of this action, I think tells us something about what a tough, rugged, difficult to hit weapon it is. Because listeners, if you've ever been to a museum and you've seen a World War machine gun set up and it looks, pretty nice and so forth, you may have even had a chance to turn it around on the tripod. They're actually quite a small target. If you're trying to shoot at one, or knock the gun out with an artillery shell or so forth, it's a pretty small target. As you've said, at the very end of this action, the machine gun was still in working order. Godley had to disable it, probably by tearing the firing pins out and throwing them in the canal. But at this stage, it's fired all its bullets, it's done everything it needs, and this is one machine gun. The other machine gun, incidentally, does get knocked out very early in the action, appears to have been destroyed by incoming fire. Slightly goes against what I've said, I suppose, but the fact that Godley and Dease's gun stays in action, and towards the end of the action, it is just Godley firing this gun on his own as the rest of the Royal Fusiliers fall back. So that tells you something. One machine gun, manned by a single surviving crewman, can have an absolutely disproportionate effect on the battlefield. And that's, I think, a worrying sign in some ways. Yes, absolutely celebrate the courage of Dease and Godley, but for the longer-term view of the war, the fact that this can be done with a single gun, I think is in some ways an indicator of the story that's going to be so common through the rest of the First World War.
I think there's a really good point that you make there. So you can imagine what one determined machine gun can do. Now let's not even go crazy and say 50. Let's just say 2. Because I think it gives you some idea, and we can maybe look at the way that machine guns are employed. And this is kind of an interesting way to maybe broach that subject, because what we need to consider, and this might be difficult to do over a podcast, but I'll give it a go, is if you think to your mind's eye, listeners, about the idea of somebody firing a machine gun at, say, a group of advancing guys coming across a field towards you. If you imagine you're pointing down the barrel here and you see guys spaced out, maybe 2, 4, 5 yards apart, not that easy to hit. You've really got to traverse the gun round quite a way. Now, that isn't a particularly efficient way. There's a lot of gaps in between soldiers at this point where your bullets can go wide and you're not going to hit a target. Now, take that same line and assume that those men are marching in a line broadly towards you. Now, if you move that gun not from the front, but you move it off to the sides, and you move a second gun off to the other side into what we refer to as enfilade positions, and you now point obliquely down that line, and you imagine those guys walking towards you, at some point, that line is almost going to be lined up in your view, one man behind the other. It means without moving the gun, you can fire directly into almost everybody in that line. And let's just make a point here. A 7.92 or a 303 bullet fired from a machine gun is going to go through 3, 4, 5, or even 6 guys. It's not one of these cases of you getting hit and getting stopped by it. So actually placing guns in a particular area and creating a killing zone, referred to in the parlance of the time as a beaten zone, is incredibly effective. Now, just to break that down a little bit further, the idea behind a beaten zone, if you think you can think of it like this, creating an imaginary box of air somewhere in no man's land and literally filling it with lead. So two guns on a fairly fixed trajectory, not firing like you see Audie Murphy in the 1950s films where he's swinging around a gun from the hip, but just holding the trigger down and making tiny little adjustments. You've already pre-sighted your position and you've got crossed lanes of machine gun bullets all aiming at the same imaginary box of air. All you need to know as a machine gunner is not to aim at somebody, it's you got to know that soldier A, in order to get to his objective, has to go through that box. And if you've got a water-cooled machine gun firing 650 rounds a minute, that's 11 rounds a second. And you've got another one firing from the other side, and you're telling somebody to walk through that box of maybe 4 feet high by 20 feet wide by 10 feet deep. It's like trying to dodge raindrops when it's raining. It's just not going to be doable. And so we're going to see absolute devastation, famously places like the Battle of Loos, Battle of Aubers Ridge, Battle of the Somme, particularly spent areas where the Germans, or the Brits for that matter, the defenders have had time to sight their machine guns effectively. Overlapping fire. There are literally no gaps in this line.
And that is where machine guns will really come of age. Machine guns are highly effective in 1914. British, we've already mentioned. The Germans make the most of their machine guns as well. And I'm reminded particularly of a quote which it sticks with me. It's actually at a rearguard action during the retreat from Mons, a place called Villers-Cotterêts, where a Brigadier Scott Kerr, or Brigadier General Scott Kerr to be precise, he's badly wounded by German machine gun fire. He never returns to service, and he, in his post-battle write-up, he just refers to the German machine guns as being horribly efficient. And this is, of course, German machine guns on the attack are able to position themselves and really pour fire in. But it's on the defensive, as you just laid out, Dan, that they are the key weapon. Because when you're on the defensive, you have all the time to create a very strong position around your machine gun, not just this elevated coal sack defensive position that Godley and Dease were manning, fully exposed to incoming fire. These are now incorporated into the trenches in dedicated machine gun nests, and they're often very difficult to observe. Generally, a machine gun won't start firing unless it really needs to start firing. Comparatively easy to move around the trenches, so as the war goes on, the Germans will create multiple false machine gun nests as well, and then they will just run the machine gun into one of these and open fire. And crucially, what you've just said, Dan, about the sheer volume of fire a machine gun can put down individually, well, now let's multiply that by several times, where machine guns overlap with each other, where there is just this constant beaten zone where bullets are falling. And the longer trench warfare goes on, the more sophisticated those machine gun positions in either side, but especially the German side, become. And to add to their lethality, of course, if you're advancing against these machine guns, you're not dodging through ruined buildings or going through forest. You're advancing across no man's land, which is nearly always completely barren. There might be shell holes you can jump into, but you've got to reach those shell holes. There might be a supporting barrage going in, but if it misses just one of the enemy's machine guns, that machine gun can inflict appalling losses on you. And as you're running across no man's land, which is, yes, there are shorter areas of no man's land, but quite often you're looking at a few hundred yards to cross. Not only are you trying to get across no man's land in the face of these bullets, but then you've got to hope that the barbed wire is cut in front of you. We love mentioning barbed wire on this podcast, but it's a serious point. If you are rushing, you're desperate to get out of this beaten zone of machine guns, and you get there and you find the barbed wire isn't adequately cut, that's fatal. The machine guns will just tack across the front of their barbed wire and just blow you to pieces. And that's an appalling experience to be trapped there. And there's no escape from this unless the machine guns have been identified and knocked out. And more of these machine guns are going to appear, of course. And just a word actually on numbers of machine guns. I think there's an enduring idea that the British Army was anti-machine gun. And there's certainly those at the time who feel the army is anti-machine gun, but my own research on this actually says it's not that the machine gun is rejected by the British Army. It's not that they don't like machine guns, they don't want machine guns. It's all about money. The army has a very small budget prior to the First World War, and plenty of people in the army would like more machine guns, but they're very expensive. You just can't have them. And so you're left with this choice in the army. There's not enough money to go around. What do you want? What are you going to prioritize? And in the end, that's what stops the army adopting more machine guns, because there's plenty of thinkers in the army who say, this is the weapon of the future. This is what we need. And interesting little wrinkle to this, the Vickers company, who manufacture Britain's main medium and heavy machine guns, charges an enormous price to the British Army. It's by far the most expensive machine gun manufacturer in the world at the time. And in fact, in 1915, the British government threatens Vickers with legal action, basically prosecuting them for being war profiteers unless they reduce the price of the machine gun, which gives you some ideas, listeners, about how expensive they are before the war. And that's why the army doesn't have anywhere near as many as the French and the Germans. But of course, really by the end of 1914, the British have felt the hard hand of German machine guns at the Battle of the River Ain and at the Battle of Ypres. And there needs to be a way to deal with these in 1915. But as you've said, Dan, when you've got mass machine guns, places like Aubers Ridge, Loos, early part of the Somme, the casualties are absolutely enormous, and knocking these machine guns out is incredibly difficult. Finding ways to deal with machine guns in 1915 is probably the biggest tactical problem the British and the French are grappling with, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking even if you take this back to its real basics and you just look at the particular numbers about this and just think from a really standard level here. Let's say, I mean, no man's land typically between 2 and 400 meters. Let's call it 200 meters. And let's, just for the sake of argument, let's make you Usain Bolt at his peak. So he's running that in 20 seconds. Now, if he's facing one machine gun, that machine gun in that 20 seconds is going to fire off 250 rounds, give or take. That is a huge number of fire coming in. That's one gun. Let's add a second or a third or a fourth. Or let's say you're not Usain Bolt, or you are Usain Bolt, but you're now carrying 60 pounds of gear and you're wearing up British Army boots and you're carrying a rifle and you're running over shell-torn ground. So you slow that whole process down significantly, add significant volumes of machine guns, and then, as you say, Spence, you might get to within 25 yards of the damn thing and you've got unbroken barbed wire in front of you. You're a point-blank target to an unsuppressed weapon that is going to do absolute carnage. There are stories in the Great War of single machine guns holding up individual battalions. Even more than that, there's a single story at Vimy Ridge of probably one machine gun holding up an entire brigade for hours. I mean, it's just, if you just miss one of those guns, and places like the Somme, those guns are actually stored down in underground dugouts. So it's not like preliminary bombardments can knock these things out. You've got to knock them out once they start firing. That's a very, very difficult prospect. And if you don't have a 100% success rate, it can be an absolute recipe for disaster. And I think, in a sense, Spence, that gives us an idea of just how high the stakes are. And it's no surprise that really by 1916 and even on to the end of the war, particularly the Germans, they're going to start replacing, when they're struggling with manpower, they're going to start replacing it with machinery.
They are, and what a way to do it. If you look at early German trench occupation in late 14, early 15, there's a tendency not exactly to pack the front line with riflemen, but certainly to have it held with a lot more riflemen than you'd see later, because that's what's going to generate the firepower. But as the war goes on, you start to see the Germans replacing their front line manning a lot more with machine guns. Why put men in the front line? Yes, they can deliver fire and they can defend that front line, but much more efficient to have half a dozen machine guns than 600 men packing the front line. And so this contributes to the German defense in depth system. You don't need to hold the front line with maximum strength because you can protect that front line with lots of machine guns in different positions. And some of these machine guns further back, some of these machine guns close to the front line or even in it for maximum firepower. You made a great point, Dan, as well, about machine guns at the Somme are actually kept underground, so they're not going to be knocked out or damaged before the battle begins. Then, once the barrage lifts, Germans quickly rush these machine guns into their pre-prepared nests and open fire with them. And as the defense in depth system becomes more complex in 1970, you have German machine guns in bunkers, which adds even more defensive strength to them, very difficult to knock out. You have machine guns arranged in this checkerboard formation, so they're hitting you not only in front and flank, but they're hitting you in depth as well. So submachine guns will be firing over the head of you to take out your reserves and the reinforcements that are trying to come up. And you create a bullet-swept zone that has never been created like this in human history. And you made a great point about Audie Murphy or movie heroes swinging machine guns around, blasting away over iron sights at a range of about 50 yards. Now, that does happen at times in the First World War, but more often than not, it's actually machine gun crews, relatively calm, at a pretty good distance away from the advancing infantry, just moving their machine gun around on pre-planned fire routes to create this beaten zone. They know the machine gun on their right and the machine gun on their left is doing the same, so you're creating this area. The machine gun behind you is firing over your heads. And unlocking that defensive system is super difficult because the only, certainly in 15 and to an extent 16, the only surefire way to take out an enemy machine gun nest is to get so close to it you can throw a lot of grenades into it, which is going to be between 15 and 30 yards, or overrun it at the point of the bayonet. And it has to be said, if you're a German machine gun crew and you get overrun by the French or the British in 1915, chance of being taken prisoner are relatively small. You've been blasting away, mowing down dozens, hundreds of their comrades. The casualty rates for machine gunners are high as a result, but the attackers have to get this close to it. And one of the reasons for that is there's no way to deal with it any other way, at least in 15. There's no way to communicate with your artillery. Once you're in battle, once you're in no man's land, you can't take a telephone with you. There's no radios. Can't really call it down unless you're stuck there for a long time. So you have to hope that the prolonged barrage has destroyed the machine guns. But as we've said, Germans often hide their machine guns underground and only bring them up when the attack starts. The British and the French both designate snipers whose sole task is to try and identify machine gun nests. And these snipers will observe the enemy line for a long time, several days, maybe even weeks before the battle, just looking for movement. Germans are very secretive about their machine guns. And then when the battle actually opens, these snipers, all they're there to do is try and knock out machine guns. And generally, actually, they prefer to shoot the barrel of a machine gun rather than try and shoot down the crew. If you shoot through the barrel and you completely wreck the barrel, that's potentially going to take longer to fix than if you shoot a crewman. There's still the others who can take over. So snipers designated for that. Smoke screens are useful because they stop the machine guns engaging you straight over iron sights, but they're not super useful because, as we've established, a lot of these machine guns are just firing on prefixed patterns. Yes, there might be some firing straight down the sights, but others have got their tables. They know exactly where they're firing. They don't need to see you to engage you. And perhaps the ultimate expression, and the very fact that it is created to deal with this problem, I think speaks to how enormous the problem of machine guns is the tank, which is originally proposed as an armored machine gun destroyer. It's going to be this caterpillar track-propelled vehicle with some sort of armored shield on the front and a gun strapped to it that it can soak up all the bullets from the German machine guns and then get close enough to them to either crush them under its tracks or shoot at them with its mounted gun. So the fact that the British and the French, because the French also start working on tanks, say, well, the only way we're going to deal with machine guns is by inventing an entirely new fighting machine, I think that speaks to the scale of the problem, Dan.
It does. It really gives you an idea of exactly, how big an issue this is. And if you've not looked at a casualty list recently, I'd imagine that will do it quite effectively too. Of course, we need to throw in the mix. So as we've mentioned so many times on this is the idea of the trifecta, though. It's the machine gun, it's artillery, and it's barbed wire. So it's not specifically one of those things, but rather the combination of those three things working together, which need to be broken in order for progress to be made in some real way on the Western Front. So there are individual elements like targeting machine gun positions with snipers at the outset of engagements, perhaps putting down smoke screen to block vision, various different things that you can do. But actually, the scale of the problem is being able to knock out all three and keep your guys alive when going across no man's land. And this is, I think, added to by the fact that The issue here is that machine guns are required not just in the infantry role, but in so many different roles at this point. You're now getting tanks by 1916. A female tank, I think, carries 7. It's ultimately going to be Lewis guns, but we're going to come on to that in a moment. You've got defensive machine guns required. You've got machine guns required for anti-aircraft work. You've got machine guns in aircraft themselves. You've got huge logistical and supply issues around all of this kind of thing. Plus the fact that they take up enormous amounts of small arms ammunition. So there's a quote actually I just read today, Spence, which is really interesting, which says that the German army reported in 1917 that 90% of their small arms ammunition expenditure is made by the machine gun alone. That's an incredible amount. 9 out of 10 bullets fired by a German on the Western Front are coming out of the barrel of a machine gun. That's a huge thing that you have to support, and actually, it's a big point.
It is. And this is the fascinating statistic I'd not heard before we started recording this podcast that just gives rise to how much firepower these weapons can put down, dwarfing the amount of firepower you can put out of your bolt action rifle. And with a greater range and with more accuracy as well. Just think, listeners, if you're a rifleman and you're shooting at 2,000 yards range, you've either got the eyes of a hawk or you're using some sort of scope, or perhaps you're being guided with binoculars, and you're only getting one shot at a time. Yes, highly trained infantrymen, such as the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, could blast out 15 to 20, maybe even more shots per minute, but that's only at about 300 yards range. Machine gun can put down thousands of rounds at 2,000 yards with a degree of accuracy, not in picking individual targets, but just smothering this area with bullets. So the 90% for small arms ammunition really gets across how many bullets are being fired in major engagements as it goes along. So that does create certain problems, though, Dan, that you need a big logistics train for. As more and more machine guns appear, they need more and more logistics. And it's not just the bullets. They're a factor too, but it's also the replacement parts, replacement barrels, in some cases, equipment, limbers with which to move them if you're not in trenches and you want to move them elsewhere. Germans use sleds, for example. The British use a gun carriage they can tow with a small horse or even a mule team. So machine guns start to become their own, in a way, their own factor within the war effort, their own branch of service, because they're demanding. And they're also demanding, I think, as they become more scientific, they start to demand a better standard of training. The idea of just, blood and guts, looking down the sights and keeping your trigger depressed while your loader feeds in the belts might be great in the movies, but in a battle, you want a lot more than this. And what we tend to see in all armies, but perhaps most strikingly within the British and also the Canadians, is the formation of a dedicated machine gun service. Heavy and medium machine guns won't be with the infantry battalions from 1915 onwards. Instead, they're going to be organized under the Machine Gun Corps, the MGC, which would handle all the heavier weapons at divisional level. And the advantage of this was it eased those logistics problems that we just mentioned. It's easier to feed these in rather than have to bring all this ammunition down to each individual infantry battalion. It allows you to organize a lot of machine guns theoretically quicker because they're all in a single unit that can be placed where they need to be. And also it allows a better standard of training, whereas infantry battalions would designate some of their men and go, right, you're going to be in the machine gun section now, go off on a training course. That's going to potentially lose some of your soldiers. It's not great. In the Machine Gun Corps, everybody's a trained machine gunner, which means they all get trained in multiples of roles. You might be officially the machine gun's loader, or you might be its carrier, but in fact, everybody's trained how to operate a machine gun. That said, though, Dan, just about the Machine Gun Corps, of all the branches of service you could be in the British Army, I think the Machine Gun Corps is one of the most dangerous to be in. About 170 men serve in the British machine gun, 170,000 men, I should say. So it's got numbers have declined dramatically. So about 170,000 men serve in the Machine Gun Corps through 15 to 18, and 62,000 of those men become casualties. So that's a casualty rate of nearly 37%, 36.7% if we're being precise. That's really heavy. 1 in 3 members of the Machine Gun Corps will be killed, wounded, or go missing in the course of the First World War. So that tells us something else, Dan. And this is a difference between using machine guns defensively, where you have them in their carefully prepared machine gun nests. You've got them nicely sighted. They're all working together. The barbed wire is protecting you. compared to what the British and Canadian Machine Gun Corps has to do, which is get these machine guns to advance into the attack. And this is one of the contrasts in the First World War. Machine guns in defensive positions, absolutely excellent, but mastering machine guns in an attacking role, it's a lot more challenging.
There's a very good point you made there, actually. And just going back to this idea of the casualty statistics, there's a good reason why the Machine Gun Corps gets the unfortunate nickname, the Suicide Corps, from 1915 onwards. And it's simply because you're such a big target on the battlefield, and your chance of getting pinged by something is exponentially higher than other troops at certain given times. So incredible guts and bravery required to be a machine gunner. It's really interesting as well, just before we go on to what you mentioned there, Spence, in terms of how this breaks down. I'm only going from memory here, but of course we start the war with two machine guns in a machine gun section attached to a battalion. By 1915, the start of the Machine Gun Corps, that goes up to a machine gun company attached to a brigade. So they could be moved around at brigade level. Later on, it's going to end up with machine gun battalions attached to divisions. So you could theoretically, if you had a single battalion or a single brigade going into action, you could put the entire division's worth of artillery specifically allocated to that unit. So it could be very effective. And of course, big benefits with training, as you rightly say. The issue, though, as we found out, as George Custer found out in 1876, machine guns not that great going forwards. They're not that quick. They're not particularly maneuverable. They are a pretty obvious target on the battlefield. Famously, the last British survivor of the Great War was a young lad named Harry Patch, who's actually part of a light machine gun team and gets pretty seriously wounded at Passchendaele, very likely because he's somewhere near a bloke carrying a machine gun. And they're just good targets all round. So we've got a number of issues that come up. The fact of carrying heavy machine guns or these big water-cooled guns is going to be really problematic, particularly over broken ground when we look at battles like Arras and Passchendaele. It's just very, very difficult to do. So there's a real desire, particularly as well, Spence, when that organic firepower, those two machine guns, two heavy guns are taken away from a battalion, to still retain within the battalion on a fairly easily accessible method some kind of added firepower. And this is really going to open the door for what we see as really a huge change in terms of machine guns in the Great War. And that's going to see a light machine gun brought into that infantry role.
It is, and the quest for light machine guns owes something to the problems you've just outlined, because just to emphasize what you said, Dan, in the attack, all the advantages that machine guns have that we've previously described, fixed positions, firing on pre-registered areas and so forth, you don't have these. Instead, you and your crew and a heavy machine gun crew in 1915, you're looking at potentially no more than 3 men, a gunner, a loader, and a carrier. In reality, you're looking at about 8 guys to get that gun forward. Guns are heavy, about 60 pounds, and that's not including your ammunition and your other bits of kit, your spare parts, your spare barrels. Can't move very fast with that. These are man-portable. You're going across broken grounds, explosions, there's artillery still falling. And crucially, not only are you slow to move, you've then got to try and find a firing position. Whereas the Germans have carefully sighted their guns, sometimes building butts to put their guns in, so elevated position to the trenches, other times putting them very low, so they basically shoot it around about shin level to really take people out of the legs. If you're an attacking French or British machine gun team, you've got to run into no man's land and find somewhere to set up where you can do something useful. Very little cover there. If you put your heavy machine gun in the middle of a shell hole, you might have some cover, but you're not going to see anything. You've got no targets. So they have to often set up in exposed positions. They're slow to move. Once they're set up, they're often very exposed. They're often firing over iron sights. I know I keep emphasizing this episode, that doesn't happen that often. In the attack, it's often the only option because you can't really set up some sort of enfilade fire once you're in the attack. You have to just basically shoot at what you can see. Now, in the longer term, for heavy and medium machine guns, that gets solved by introducing machine gun barrages, where the machine guns actually stay behind the line, and instead they just fire this barrage straight over the top of the attacking infantry, working on the same principles as defensive machine guns, just tacking around, creating huge beaten zones where there's this constant rain of bullets. Very, very suppressive effect. Really good at keeping enemies' heads down. But what are you going to do to give your infantry firepower once they're going into battle? Because although these machine gun barrages are often highly effective, they stop the enemy moving, at some point your attacking infantry is going to need more firepower to break a point, and that's where light machine guns come from. And almost as soon as the war begins, really, all nations start looking for light machine guns. And what's quite interesting to me is, in comparison to the medium and heavy machine guns, the Vickers and the MG08, which are basically the same gun, French Hotchkiss, and by extension American Hotchkiss, a little different. In fact, every army goes for something a little bit different in terms of light machine gun, and everybody's looking for a gun that can do a little bit of everything, that you can carry forward into battle, preferably by one man, maybe two, but ideally one man, and it's light enough to get into position and open fire. The problem the armies have is you have to make certain compromises with this. It's not going to fire such big bullets as some of the heavy guns. It's probably not going to be water cooled because that makes the gun heavier. So instead, everybody looks for different options. And it actually produces some quite iconic weapons of this period.
Yeah, there's a couple that I think are really very interesting. I'm going to I think, focus specifically here on the British and the American variants because they're quite interesting. So the famous British one, I think if you were to draw a light machine gun of the First World War, this might well be the shape that you draw. It's the famous Lewis gun. So we're talking about a wider air-cooled barrel. So big, wide, what looks like a big, wide aperture. Actually got obviously a thin barrel within it. That's used to disperse the heat that's formed from firing, and a big flat disc on top. Now, this can be stacked in a single or a double row. What happens is that disc, which carries the ammunition, is going to rotate as the gun fires, and it's going to feed almost like a dinner plate style. It's going to feed directly into the Lewis gun, which is actually an American invention, which the Americans don't really adopt at first, but the British do. This is a bipod mounted gun, so it can be carried and fired and operated by a single man. He's going to have a load of guys with him carrying extra ammunition, but in essence, this guy's not much bigger than a single rifleman. He can carry a gun. It's heavier, but he can get around the battlefield fairly accurately. And he's not hugely obvious as well to enemy troops. You know, bloke with a heavy machine gun certainly is, but you can carry a Lewis gun, and men routinely do. So that's one option. And then looking really towards the very end of the war, the Americans bring out something that's perhaps most famous in the Second World War. It's known as the BAR. It's the Browning Automatic Rifle, and it quite simply is what it says on the tin. It's an automatic rifle. So a box magazine, I think of only 20 rounds spent, again, bipod mounted, 30-06, so fairly, it's the standard American caliber, but it can put down 20 rounds in a very short period of time and is a great kind of squad suppressive fire weapon. It's used with really good effect in the Meuse Argonne. Again, not big in terms of its ammunition capacity. 20 rounds isn't going to last you very long, but it's really gives you that additional firepower when you need it on a tactical level. So there are lots of different variants. The French have probably a less successful one, I think, in the Chauchat, which is maybe not quite as reliable as it could be. It's very distinctive ammunition loading as well. It's got a kind of banana-shaped magazine. Lots of them made, though, 262,000 of them. So if you can stamp those out pretty quick, they can really change things. I think what's crucial to this, Spencer, and maybe it comes in later on when we talk about kind of development of small unit tactics with pamphlets and things coming out. Actually, what it does, it really designates additional firepower down at a much lower level within the battalion. So a young officer has got this weapon at his disposal and can really affect things on the battlefield in real time.
He can, and this is a huge change. Especially in the British Army, going back to what we said earlier on, at the start of the war, a battalion of 1,000 men will have 2 Vickers machine guns, one gun per 500 men. By 1917, a British platoon will have 1 Lewis gun per between 20 and 30 men. And other armies get similar proportions as well as more and more light machine guns start to come into service. And this is really, really completely radical, because suddenly, instead of being a fixed weapon, and by definition medium and heavy machine guns tend to be fixed, we've already described difficulties of getting them forward, light machine guns are mobile. You can carry them around, you can fire them from the hip, what's called walking fire at the time. And although it's not easy to be accurate, there's plenty of examples of light machine guns being hip fired by people going forward. Tough guys, you need some pretty strong core strength to stop your gun kicking, but it happens. And the other thing is, you made a great point, Dan. These guns are pretty small. In the midst of a confusing battle, a Lewis gun team goes running past your position. in the smoke and the haze, you wouldn't really notice that they had a Lewis gun relative to rifles. And yet they set that up. They can fire it from prone. The Lewis gun can be bipod mounted, so really easy to set up. And suddenly you can have a lot of firepower being put into you. And crucially as well, this means that firepower is always traveling with the attacking infantry. Whereas before, we've mentioned, difficult to get machine guns into the attack. Yes, they can fire barrages, which are very, very useful. But if you're fighting to seize a German pillbox or clear out a German defensive line in shell holes and you can't communicate back with your heavy weapons, well, now you can engage them with your own Lewis gun or your BAR or your Shoshar or whatever you want to lay your hands on. It can now be used against this. And that gives you a lot more mobility, a lot of flexibility. British platoons are trained to always try and get their Lewis guns onto the enemy's flank to deliver enfilade fire. Pour it in there. And of course, platoons can work together. They can, and they do work together. They're not fighting their own individual wars. You might combine the Lewis guns of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 platoons. Suddenly you've got 6 Lewis guns. That's a lot of firepower. You get those into the right position and they will blast defensive positions apart. And I would say that even more so than the heavy machine guns fighting in their fixed defenses, which we've already established, redefine the nature of the First World War, the ability to carry light machine guns into battle and use them as a tool of the infantry attack, that's even more revolutionary because we still have this to this day. This is still a fundamental part of infantry squad tactics, using your platoon support weapon, like a machine gun, to lay down lots and lots of firepower. And in fact, a quirky example of this is the Germans have their own light machine guns, and their initial light machine gun, the MG08/15, introduced in 1915, which is meant to be a lighter, more mobile MG08, it doesn't quite fulfill its design brief. It's pretty heavy, it's quite cumbersome. The Germans find it doesn't really serve its purpose in the attack, although it's still very good in defensive positions, and lots of them will be used in the war. But the Germans also use a Danish invented and initially manufactured machine gun, which is the Madsen, which has a magazine you slam in the top. It looks rather like a brain gun of the Second World War. The Madsen is a more effective German light machine gun. It's also used by the Imperial Russian Army, strangely enough. They bought a large number before the First World War. But the Madsen gun cropped up in the current Russia-Ukraine war. There's a photograph from the early part of the invasion where there were some Ukrainian troops and one of them had a Madsen gun strapped to his back. And it was still being used in militaries right into the 2000s because it's super reliable. It apparently makes a very, very intimidating sound when it opens up. It's got a really distinctive hammering sound. And the fact that a machine gun that I think was invented in 1901 in Denmark and used in the First World War is still seeing action today tells you something about, one, how revolutionary light machine guns are, and secondly, how useful they are in a squad combat.
It's incredible that actually. I was thinking maybe, Spence, there's one scenario particularly in which we can maybe illustrate the importance of light machine guns. And if you imagine right now, typical advance, could be British, could be French, could be American, maybe break in, capture a bit of ground, famous bite and hold conditions. What's the one thing we know is going to happen? Of course, it's going to be that the Germans are going to launch counterattack. And earlier in the war, a situation where a counterattack might come in, you can be pretty certain there's going to be no heavy machine guns up with you. That new bit of captured ground, you might get very lucky and find an operational German machine gun still with some ammunition around it, and maybe got a couple of guys know how to use it. Can't rely on that. You absolutely can't guarantee that's going to happen. What if you get there and the firing pins are gone, or there's no ammunition there, or the barrel's been destroyed? That's a really serious problem. Now, if you can turn up there with your own light machine guns, you can all of a sudden exponentially increase your chances of holding off the almost inevitable German counterattack. And we see this time and again, actually, in terms of the defense in depth system. When the British finally get their teeth into it and understand the principles behind it, really in April and May of 1918, they're going to start to use them very effectively. So we're going to find these little pockets that are chock full of Lewis guns, particularly. And they offer great local firepower, way more flexible. In 1915, if you capture a German trench, there's no way you're setting up a heavy machine gun tripod mounted to fire out of the back of a German trench, which hasn't been reversed, or it doesn't have a fire step there, you might get away with it with a bipod mounted Lewis gun, though. So bringing in your own firepower with you and turning it round to really hold off German counterattacks, massive and I think much overlooked part of the role of the light machine gun.
What a great point. And I'm glad you've brought it up, because this is something that in the pre-light machine gun period has been a serious problem for the British and, to a lesser extent, the French. The French do get light machine guns a bit before the British. But I'll give you just one concrete example, listeners. Of the Battle of Loos, 1915, in October, 28th Division, which is a pretty tough, regular pre-war division, has a horrible experience trying to hold on to a German position called the Hohenzollern Redoubt. And in the aftermath of the battle, one of the problems that's identified is nobody can get machine guns into this captured position. Some mortars go up, but they're pretty crude. They get knocked out. It's impossible to get Vickers machine guns up in there. A handful of Lewis guns arrive, but not enough, and they get knocked out. And when the division is assessing what has gone wrong, that's one of its number one problems. It can't get heavy machine guns in, whereas the Germans can constantly hammer the British position with machine guns, then follow it with attacks. And that ability to really quickly put your capture position, consolidate your capture position with automatic firepower is crucial. And the British approach that starts to become more standard in late 17 and into 18, bite and hold, capture a position, consolidate on it, await the German counterattack and defeat it. In some ways, that's only possible at a tactical level if you've got light machine guns. And what we see when British troops consolidate on capture positions is we see the flexibility of the platoon system as well, where the battalion CO will often fix a number of his platoon machine guns in various different defensive positions. So you've got interlocking fields of fire or just a massive firepower instead. And it's absolutely crucial. I would also add, though, that the counter side of this is as the war becomes more mobile in 1918, the trench lines start to break down. The 100 days advance begins from the Allies. They have problems with German light machine guns moving around. The Germans, incidentally, are using a lot of captured British and French equipment in the summer of 1918 that they captured in the spring offensive. And you get the strange experience of British troops coming under fire from multiple Lewis guns, which have been captured by the Germans. And so light machine guns and dealing with them and using them in this way completely changes the nature of infantry combat, and that ability to consolidate very quickly and repel German counterattacks. It's an unpleasant surprise for the Germans once this starts to become standard practice, but it's crucial for Allied success.
Something I want to ask you actually here, because as we've kind of gone back to this mobile warfare of 1918, of course, what we need to remember is not only are, machine guns and infantry tactics improving, but of course, artillery spotting and artillery targeting is improving exponentially. Do you think then, Spence, in that case, when we get to 1918 and we start to see this mobile warfare again and the Germans are once again returning to using machine guns, is the inherent flexibility of a light machine gun more effective than maybe an isolated heavy machine gun, which could get knocked out by artillery quite easily?
I think it is. And I think there's several things that contribute to this. One is, at least until the Germans fall back into the Hindenburg Line, the Germans are fighting from defensive positions. They've not had anywhere near the amount of time or the amount of labor to turn into these miniature fortresses. They're still tough nuts. These aren't half-cocked positions. They are entrenched, they have barbed wire, but they don't have the level of sophistication that came with occupying the same area of ground for years. If you think about the Somme defenses, Germans have been on the Somme for 2 years by the time the British launch a major attack, and they've turned the area into a fortress. Whereas in the 100 days, quite often the Germans are fighting from terrain that they captured 4 months earlier, 4 or 5 months earlier. They've turned it into a defensive position, but it's nowhere near the same strength. And that means you can't create the deep dugouts and hide your machine guns under there. Heavy machine guns are more exposed. I think as well, another factor in 1918, heavy machine guns can't move very easily, of course. You've got lots more Allied tanks. Tanks can be damaged and even knocked out by machine guns. German machine guns can fire armor-piercing bullets. But generally, if you've got a tank going against a machine gun, the tank's going to win 9 times out of 10. And so more tanks, heavier bombardments on lesser German defense positions. Yes, heavy machine guns are still a part of the German defensive network, but they're not the absolutely battlefield-defining weapon of 1915. Now they're part of a wider system. Whereas German light machine guns that you can run around with, you can redeploy quickly, they don't have a big footprint, single man can operate them or maybe a pair. They become more useful. And certainly once the Allies have broken through the Hindenburg Line and you're fighting really an open country, you see a lot of the Germans quickly putting a village or a wood line into a defensive position, set up some machine guns in there, light machine guns and so on. And then they get engaged by Allied light machine guns as well. The Allies trying to work onto a flank or using lots of suppressive machine gun fire to keep the Germans' heads down so the bombers, the grenade men can get in close and so forth. And what you're really seeing is the essence of modern 21st century infantry tactics. And that's only possible because of light machine guns.
It's fascinating, and I wonder if I know we've made this comparison before. You look at the story of 1914, and you went to the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, who had 2 heavy machine guns, static ones at Nimy Bridge in 1914, and you looked at the same battalion in 1918, who probably had 20-odd Lewis guns, as well as, lots of heavy machine guns locally and all of these kind of things. They're just worlds apart. And it goes to show that, the evolution that we see on the Western Front of the Great War is fascinating throughout all aspects. I want to, as we come to start rounding this off, Spence, maybe go back to the premise that we looked at right at the start of this episode. I wonder if we can address this question. Was the machine gun a or the defining weapon of trench warfare on the Western Front?
Great question. Listeners, let us know your thoughts in the comments or drop us a line, because this is still something that's debated. And I'm going to give a mixed answer here, because one thing we know and we discussed in our Wounded episode is the thing that kills and wounds more than anything else in the Great War is artillery. And to a large extent, artillery defines the First World War. I still think artillery is the king of the battlefield ultimately, and that's the definitive weapon. But if you're an infantryman, actually involved in the front line, I think that what you're going to think about most is machine guns. And several reasons for this is, one, when infantry are under artillery fire, it's almost an abstract. Yes, it can be terrifying. Yes, it's going to inflict lots of casualties potentially. But you don't see, except in very rare circumstances, you don't see the gunners firing at you. You don't see the enemy field guns or heavy guns. It's almost a distant thing. It's an impersonal thing. It doesn't, yes, it's going on and it's deadly, but you don't necessarily feel that the gunners are firing at you. And indeed, they're not. They're firing in areas. Machine guns, though, are different. They almost feel like a personal style of attack, because although we've established machine guns don't have to see you to mow you down, they could be firing on a fixed pattern, they're still engaging you within a few thousand yards. And potentially, even if you can't see the machine gun, you might see its muzzle flash from its dugout. You can certainly hear that machine gun hammering away. And for infantry, this comes across in British, German, French accounts, American accounts. You read about, the barrage was terrible, very tough, but one thing that comes out very strongly is when attacks begin and all the machine guns start firing. It's really, really disturbing. I mean, being under machine gun fire feels a lot more personal than being fired at by artillery. This is also one of the reasons why machine gun barrages have this enormous suppressive effect, more suppressive, in fact, than artillery barrages. Artillery barrages inevitably have gaps between them as guns reload, people run their guns back into position if they've recoiled and things. Machine gun barrages don't. They're just constantly this hail of bullets and you can't move, you're pinned down. And so I think for an infantryman, going into the attack and suddenly hearing German machine guns open up is terrifying, because they are potentially looking at you. You feel they're looking at you. They're blasting you. And to bring this round to say, do machine guns define the First World War? I think machine guns might define the Western Front at a tactical level, because once you're down to platoons and half companies, you're battling away. The artillery's often moved on. The creeping barrages somewhere else. The Germans are firing at something else. Yes, there might still be shells hitting the area, but what you're really boils down to is, can you as the attacker eliminate the enemy's machine guns and allow you to capture this position? And so I think at a tactical level, for infantry officers and men, machine guns do define the Western Front. Perhaps on a larger scale, we might say an operational scale, it's all about artillery, because without artillery, no operation is going to succeed. But at a tactical level, if you can't deal with the enemy's machine guns, you're not going to succeed either. So that's a really long answer to a straightforward single-line question. But what do you think, Dan?
I was really hoping you weren't going to ask me back what I thought, because actually I don't think I disagree with anything that you said there. I think if you were to, if you were to draw that famous trifecta of the Great War, the machine gun has rightly earned its place as one of the defining weapons of the Great War. The defining one, no, I think I'm going to lean more in your direction here and say I think artillery holds that crown. But of course, machine gun, particularly when in partnership with barbed wire, and certainly for the first really 2 years of the war, is really the unconquerable problem that infantry is going to face. And of course, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people are gonna be killed or wounded as a result of machine gun fire in the Great War. So it certainly is not something to be overlooked. But it is a fascinating subject, Spence, and it rounds us off and brings us quite nicely to the end of this topic, I think. Just to finish off, I just want to throw this out there to our fascinating, dedicated audience who have got huge amounts of knowledge about, of course, all subjects on the Western Front. We are constantly looking at different areas that we're going to explore, different subjects and things like that. And what would be great to be have your opinion, your feedback and thoughts. What would you like to hear us take on in terms of the subjects that relate to the Great War in the near future? If you've got anything in mind, do drop us a line. Let us know. We'll be delighted to continue. And look forward to what the rest of this year and into next year brings, Spence.
Absolutely, Dan. And just to echo what you've said, we've said this before, it's worth saying again, we read every email we get, we read all the comments. There's so many, especially emails, we can't reply to them all, I'm sorry, but we do read them. And so your suggestions, your comments, your piece of information you share with us, they're all really gratefully received. And as you know, if you're a regular listener, we do go through these and put them into listeners' Q&A episodes from time to time as well. So it's not in vain, never think it's in vain. If we can get around to answering it, we will. But we'd love to hear, what would you like to hear more of? What episodes have you enjoyed so far? Would you like to hear more battles, for example, more thematic episodes like this? Any thoughts? We'd be really grateful of hearing them.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Where their obvious targets were both snipe shooters. Snipe shooters? There's the outtake. What is wrong with me today? I've drunk too much coffee. Try and tangle my tongue. So